Hello, everyone, and welcome into another episode of Data Chat Live. My name is Cameron Callan. I'm your host. Joining me, as always, is Mike Fong. Mike, how are you doing today?
I'm very well. We've just got back from our EMEA team day.
EMEA Team Day, what does that mean?
We went out for like lunch and we played some games at a local venue. And now, the funnest part is obviously Data Chat Live. And then the frivolities continue tonight into the late evening.
Fantastic. And you're getting ready for the holiday season out there in London?
Yeah, absolutely. It's getting very festive. It's getting very cold, actually. I always like a cold, festive season. I don't like it when it's lukewarm and muggy.
Yeah, it makes it really feel more like the season, huh?
I was considering wearing a Christmas jumper or maybe one of those fake Santa Claus beards today, but I didn't have the courage for that.
Now, I tried to get as close to candy cane as I possibly could for you. Yeah, I agree. The cold weather, we got our first bit of snow the last couple of weeks here in the state of Utah. It feels different. I was just down in Sydney, Australia for the IAPP event they were holding down there last week. And something about hearing about let it snow when it's 98 degrees outside, that just doesn't quite feel right. So it's good to be back here in North America. Well, I appreciate everyone joining today. We got a very special guest joining us. We have with us today Elizabeth Sexton from Adobe. Elizabeth, say hi to everyone.
Good morning. Good day to everyone. Thanks for joining.
Now, Elizabeth is the Principal Privacy Product Manager over at Adobe. A lot of love shared between ObservePoint and Adobe, ongoing partnership there. So, Elizabeth, great to have you in. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what your role is as the Principal Privacy Product Manager there at Adobe?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me join. I certainly love diving into one of my favorite topics. And so my role at Adobe is I work in the digital experiences business unit, which is our enterprise business. And in the enterprise business, I lead our global privacy and regulated industry for the digital experiences team, which spans a whole variety of different products and offerings to customers. And it means that I work on products that support and empower Adobe's customers to really interweave their own kind of organizational privacy values, all the while they're using the Adobe applications and the Adobe stack.
Okay, so instead of being a product manager over a single product, you're a product manager over a whole portfolio and how it relates to the privacy space. Do I have that right?
That's correct. So I hold a couple of different roles. I am a product owner, so I do have my own products. I also support what we call the trust tools, which are a set of tools that assist customers in privacy, security, and data governance. And then I act as the SME for privacy and regulated industries across our set of products and offerings in Adobe Experience Cloud.
Fantastic. And it's that role as an SME that we really wanted to bring in and get your expertise on as we're talking today about getting sensible about sensitive data. And I know a lot on this webcast, we talk a lot about data, we talk about data privacy. We wanted to lay a little bit of foundation to get started and help people understand what are the different classifications of data? What are the different industries that are adherent to those classifications and special laws and regulations, both here in the United States, as well as in Europe, as well as the other jurisdictions our customers are listening in from. Before we get there, though, I want to just get a little bit of background. Obviously, you didn't start your career at Adobe, and you have a really rich background that has given you even more experience in this space specifically. Tell us a little bit about how you got here.
Yeah, well, I am probably the first person to tell you that your career is not always linear. Mine was not a stepwise approach that everyone thinks of. I think when you're in, high school or coming up, you're like, oh, I'm going to take the first step, and then the second step is very logical. I actually started off as a mental health therapist. So I used to see patients, and I was in a rehabilitation setting at that time. I actually had the benefit of being promoted into a role where I did state, federal reporting. So that kind of enticed me into some of the how do we report statistics, how do we report certain types of data, the confidentiality of that data, which was integral to my patients and my consumers, as well as to the business I ran. And then from there, I actually went on to work at a major medical center, and I was essentially a hospital administrator, if you would. And in that role, I had the good fortune of being asked to hold a position that would manage our HIPAA compliance within the department that I oversaw. And so with that, I actually realized how much I loved the passion of advocacy that I had when I was a therapist, because you are, as a therapist, you're advocating for your patients all the time and advocating with them. And then you combine that with the regulatory pieces of HIPAA and overseeing the HIPAA compliance within my own department. I realized that I could kind of marry those two things together and really get a lot of bang for my buck. And it was really where my passion area was. And then ultimately, I kind of rounded it out. About 7 years ago, I went and got an executive MBA through the University of Utah Eccles Business School, and made a move to Adobe, because that's logical, right? You spend a bunch of years in healthcare, you go to tech, and at Adobe, I was really able to marry both of those things together, being able to use my operational capabilities as well as my passion for people and my passion for regulations. And so
Elizabeth,
here I am.
Just for our sort of non-healthcare audience, can you tell us just a bit quickly about what HIPAA is, how long it's been around, and kind of how that led you to, maybe how it led you to an MBA, for example?
Yeah, so the Healthcare Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. So notice there's no privacy in the title of that law. There is some information in there, but there is an actual section on privacy within HIPAA, but it's not actually part of the law. A lot of people mistake the P. There's got to be, privacy in there, but it's actually not in the title. And so HIPAA came out when I actually entered the workforce as a therapist. I actually thought it was the kiss of death of my career. I was like, oh my gosh, this law is so prescriptive. It's going to be so hard. So that was in the mid to late 90s that HIPAA came out, and then high tech came out about a decade later. And so with those pieces, HIPAA really governs it's intended to create transparency for how billing is done, how communication is done. And it's really intended to protect the patient or the consumer, depending upon where you're at in the ecosystem. And so a lot of times things get ascribed to HIPAA that aren't really HIPAA. They aren't part of the law. People unintentionally say they are. However, HIPAA is really designed to create the opportunity to send data for things like to your insurer to get your bill paid. And it also allows for communication between providers, emergency personnel, or for the safety of the community at large. And so there's a whole bunch of sections within HIPAA. And my real love and passion area is privacy, which is probably one of the more challenging ones because it's always context specific.
So unlike some general data privacy regulations that we've seen roll out over the last several years, HIPAA, it sounds like, is very specific to industries or providers that have to apply the principles to what they're doing, but it's not generally applicable to all businesses of all industries. Is that right?
That is correct. HIPAA is applicable to what they call a covered entity, and they very clearly define what a covered entity is. So think of your doctor's office, your dental office, your pharmacy, where you pick up your medication, can also be considered a covered entity. And then anyone who helps support them, those would be business associates. Those are people like the billing office. And then they also have a carve out for healthcare clearinghouses, which are really, there's a handful of them, but there aren't a ton of healthcare clearinghouses out there. So it is really specific. And it is very specific to healthcare and a specific type of data. It's actually specific to protected health information, which is different than just your run-of-the-mill health data. So there's lots of nuances to consider, and not everyone has to comply with HIPAA, not just in the healthcare domain, but outside the domain.
Okay. Now, while we're defining terms, and I like setting this baseline here, there's a few terms in the data privacy landscape that we hear a lot. I just want to make sure we all understand what they are. So starting off with just personal information or personally identifiable information, PII as we call it here in the US, PI in some other jurisdiction. In general, what is personal information and how should we be thinking about that from a data perspective?
Great question. I want to take a little bit of a step back. I think when you think about what are the terms, the biggest piece to remember is that nowhere is there a static definition of these terms.
Okay.
So as much as we want to say, point here, this is the place, there is no actual place except for in the jurisdiction for which you're operating. So it is very specific to the industry and it's specific to the jurisdiction you're in. So for example, the definition can change if you're in California versus if you're in Utah versus if you're in London. And so generally personal information is a term that's used here in North America and is personally identifiable information is more North America based. And it really is ways that you distinguish or trace an individual's identity. Essentially, you can point to it and say, that's Elizabeth Sexton because I have her date of birth or I have her social security number or I have her information that identifies her specifically. Whereas GDPR defines it a little differently and they define it as personal data. And that's any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person. And so you can see there's a little bit of difference in that GDPR is a little more inclusive and doesn't say, I just want to protect that data that relates just to Elizabeth and what we define as identifiable. It's pretty much anything that would belong to me that could identify me as a human being.
It also includes anything that you could piece together with anything else that could then lead you to be identifiable, which it's very, very vague and very wide.
Yes. Any triangulation of that information or any other method that you want to put that data together can then be covered under the way it's defined in GDPR. I think it's important to note that even though we've typically called it PII in North America, there is a transition to calling it personal information or personal data because of the state law changes. And so, you know, I recommend people go out and check the state laws for which you're operating in because that definition is getting wider and wider every day.
For sure. And then we've also seen nuances within a lot of those state laws, also within GDPR, as far as additional classifications of certain types of personal information. So I've heard about sensitive personal information, or I think another term we heard was personal health information related specifically to HIPAA and some of the laws here. Talk to us about the distinctions between what's personal and what's maybe even more personal.
Yeah. So sensitive personal information is anything that if it were lost or compromised or disclosed would harm, embarrass, or otherwise inconvenience an individual. It's typically thought of in several buckets like medical information, educational records, financial data or information, or employment records. And so again, this is jurisdictionally relevant that it's different. Like there's different things that are covered under what's called GDPR sensitive than what is covered under sensitive personal data here in the US. And sensitive personal data becomes even more nuanced because it can have an industry twist to it. So that sensitive personal data, think of it as a big bucket of things like your federal ID number, or in the US, your social security number. It can encompass all of those elements. And then if you say, oh, put that in the context of healthcare, then you take a subset of that sensitive personal data and it's called protected health information. Protected health information is anything that was shared with the covered entity. So your doctor, your dentist, again, anything regarding your diagnosis, your demographics are considered to be protected health information in that case. Much like GDPR, once you start to triangulate data that might have been personal data to start with, once you enter into the doctor's, and it might have been sensitive when they added your social security number to it, then when you go to the doctor's office, it meets the subset criteria of protected health information. That is different than health data, which is another set of sensitive data. And then there's also financial services information that has sensitive data. So you can see how it starts to get that matrices going, and it starts to become more and more complex as you layer on the industry, as you layer on the specifics with jurisdictional requirements.
And Elizabeth, how do they try to judge whether something would be sensitive? Because my understanding is that you might judge some information to be sensitive if it's the kind of thing where prejudice could be applied against you. So maybe you're voting, or how you identify, or your religion. Like, is that the definition? Anything that could be used to make it prejudice a decision against you? Is that kind of where why that definition exists?
I don't know exactly the why, but definitely those are included, and they are specifically included in some of the laws, such as GDPR. Like, they want very much to protect anything that, as you said, could prejudice another. It could also cause you harm. It's the disclosure of sensitive data has the highest likelihood of direct harm to the consumer.
All right. So with that baseline of some of those distinctions, and it does sound like there is a lot of nuance there. It's not just one definition to rule them all. It's definitional based on jurisdiction. It's definitional based off of what you do as a business and the type of data you collect. Going back to your subject matter expertise in healthcare, there's been a lot of news over the last year or so coming out of this three-lettered agency or three-letter group called the OCR. You want to tell us a little bit about what HHS OCR is, especially for those outside of the United States?
Yeah, so here in the US, we just talked about HIPAA, which is the Health Insurance and Portability Accountability Act. And that's actually housed under Health and Human Services, which is HHS. Trying to get all the acronyms out is really a struggle.
Yeah.
And then the enforcement arm of HIPAA is called the Office of Civil Rights, or OCR, here in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And so they have been taking a very serious approach to this, and they've partnered with a fellow agency.
Another three-letter agency, as I understand, is that right?
That is correct.
And they first started publishing a few things. I think it was back in December of 2022 of last year. And then there's been a little bit of back and forth between people that are for and against some of this guidance. And then in July, I believe it was, there was a letter issued. In fact, I think we have a template of this letter. Let me go ahead and share that out. So the OCR, along with the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, issued a letter to, I believe it was 130 different healthcare related organizations. What can you tell us about this guidance or this letter or this threat? I don't know. How should we be thinking about this communication that went out from the US government?
Yeah, it is guidance, and that's how the OCR positions it. This is guidance associated with the HIPAA High Tech Act, which talks about how technology is used in the course of healthcare business operations. And in this case, they are really saying, hey, as a reminder, we also include tracking technology, which can be deployed through pixels or cookies or a number of different methodologies on your actual public website to be also governed by HIPAA, and you need to apply all the same rules. So if you have a website or a mobile site and you have tracking technology on it, you will be held accountable for everyone who's dropped tracking cookies on your site. So user beware, go out and check your sites, make sure you know who's tagging along and scraping your data.
And what's the concern there? Is it that, I as a consumer am going to be looking at specific prescription drugs or specific mental health care or something like that, and Facebook and Google is going to see the pages that I was on and make assumptions about that? Is that the way we should be looking at this?
Yeah, and not only would they be making the assumptions about it, it could be used for data science, it can be used for advertising, cross-site advertising, marketing. If there isn't an understanding that the data is sensitive and needs to be treated as sensitive, and under HIPAA, you actually have to sign an agreement that flows down the requirements, which is called a business associate agreement. If none of that has occurred, then the data is essentially been breached, and the data is being misused for other purposes.
Hmm.
So
Now,
Elizabeth, are you saying that if Facebook signed a business associate agreement with each of these healthcare providers, then that would state their understanding the data they were collecting from these healthcare providers' websites was potentially of that personal sensitive data nature, and then they'd probably agree to ring fence or protect it additionally in some way? Is that kind of what should happen?
Typically, that is what happens if a covered entity is going to share data with a business associate or another entity. They have to sign the business associate agreement, which flows down the legal obligations. And the business associate is responsible for the data just as much as the covered entity is in that agreement. And it stipulates how the data must be treated. Now, that does mean that then that data would not likely be used for marketing and cross-site advertising, because that is an entirely separate item, and marketing is not something that is typically permissible under, your average just click the I agree on a website. It requires informed consent of the individual.
And I think there's a nuance that you mentioned there. It's simply having a Meta or a Google Pixel on a website. That's not the concern. It's the data that's being collected by those pixels. So in a lot of ways, there's certain advertising and other measurement pixels that can be set up to only capture very limited amounts of data. And if you do that, you're in a much better position. But the concern is that the FTC and HHS is just seeing a lot of these things across websites, and they're not quite sure what data is being collected. How should I be thinking about that?
No, I actually think there's actually some recent case law that will help folks articulate and understand how this came about. So GoodRx was the result of an FTC fine and an outcome with the FTC where they're going to have to comply with certain things in order to continue to do business. The reason is not just that they have the data, it's how the data is being protected and how the data could be used. And so consumers would have had no expectation to think that when they logged in to get a coupon to get their Celebrex, for example, that data would then show up in a cross-site advertising event on their Meta sites, or that they would have been offered some special trial opportunity on the right rail of their email. I mean, all you have to do to understand the OCR's perspective is take a step back and say to yourself, and this is something that I've used a lot from the time that I was a therapist through now, which is think about your most recent diagnosis that you really wouldn't want to publish on Facebook. Mm-hmm. Now, Facebook has that information, or any other site, Google has that information, anyone, and you're in a big business meeting and you've decided that it's boring. And so you open up your personal email and lo and behold, up pops an ad that pertains to that diagnosis. Mm. How would you feel? Would you understand that that information came from the fact that you went to your doctor's office to schedule an appointment, and lo and behold, when you scheduled the appointment, that data was actually pulled through that pixel and landed over in some other entity that you had no idea and you've never agreed to share it with them?
Or like we do so frequently now, imagine you're in a big business meeting and you're sharing your screen.
Oh, yes.
And suddenly a banner advert appears on the side, or a full screen advert appears for whichever condition you might have visited a relevant website for, right?
Exactly.
Yikes.
And so that's where some of the sensitive data discussion about the harm to the individual, because that would cause direct harm to the individual. And the individual also would not have necessarily had the right to have said, I don't want to share that information, because they never knew that the pixel was there. They never knew that that data was actually going somewhere else.
Yeah. Now, as I understand it, there has been some pushback against this guidance. Tell us a little bit about some of the legal action that's still kind of out there and pending.
Yeah. So, I mean, of course, it's not over yet. There is action against, essentially, there's several entities. One is a doctors consortium and the state of Texas essentially saying, hey, you guys have overstepped your bounds. Like, we don't know the purpose for which someone landed on our website. And so you can't say that everyone has the right of confidentiality as they would in the doctor's office by just landing on the site. And so they're pushing back on the OCR's guidance and saying they think it's a massive overstep by the Office of Civil Rights and Health and Human Services. So the reality is this is going to play out in a court of law, and it is likely then that case law will be the precedence that we go forward with. In the meantime, that has not stopped the OCR from moving forward with action against entities who have pixels or other devices that are tracking information, such as the most recent Costco lawsuit involving individuals who used the pharmacy website and had no idea that when they ordered their pharmacy and all their other goods from Costco, that data was also going to get shared somewhere else.
Yeah, and that's exactly where I was going next. It's kind of separate, but similarly with the legal action against Costco and specifically their pharmacy properties, just understanding what is it possible that these pixels could be tracking about me and my behavior as a consumer as I'm interacting with what can be very sensitive topics to me as far as my personal health, mental health, physical health, all of those aspects. So I think what you said is right. This is going to play out in the court of law. There's going to be precedent set. I think right now we're all kind of in a wait and see mode. Would you agree with that?
I would. I actually, there's something that's been a big part of conversation in the last 3 months, and I think Cameron, you heard some of this when I visited Edge this fall, and that is regarding how you sign up for a site. So as a consumer, if you're saying to yourself, like, man, like this is not my cup of tea, I don't really want all of this. It's not a full stop method to prevent all of this, but one thing that you as a consumer can do is not use a federated ID, which means when you go to that website and it says, sign in with my Google account or sign in with my Meta account, you actually make the hard decision to scroll down to the bottom where it says create your own account, and you go through and create your own separate account. Because once you sign in with what's called a federated ID, then that data all becomes linked together and a collection occurs. And so one way as a consumer, I really encourage folks to actually make the choice. Is this something that you really want to have happen? If not, like, it's painful, I get it. I personally have made the choice that I will not federate my identity because I want to make the decision each time I go, how much do I trust that provider? How much do I trust that vendor? How much do I trust that brand? And then decide what I want to share from there.
Yeah, I think that's
Elizabeth,
great.
Sorry, an interesting, you mentioned these federated IDs from those big tech giants. Do those federated IDs, when you click accept or sign in with one of these, is there an assumed acceptance of like their terms and conditions that overrules the terms and conditions of each individual website that it's used on?
I think that has been the assumption.
Right.
But there's nowhere in there where you got the terms and conditions or terms of use pop up when you said, click to sign in with my Meta account. There is no pop-up that says, and here's the terms. We're going to collect everything. We're going to track you from where you go from here to the next site. None of that's actually disclosed. So it's an assumption of consent. It's not actual consent.
And we are seeing those federated IDs pop up more and more, especially since, here in Europe, since GDPR, it's been a lot easier just for an organization to, stick that message in the top right corner and say, would you like to sign in with Google, or would you like to sign in with, say, your LinkedIn, right? And so that the convenience, but you're saying people don't have the choice. Like there's no T's and C's before you click a yes or no, basically.
100%. And I totally get the convenience, and each person should make their own decision. But you have to decide, is convenience worth sharing whatever you're going to do on the site once you sign in? Is that really worth giving up that data?
Yeah. Now, a lot of what we've been talking about to this point has been focused primarily on the healthcare space some of the information that's being, at least of the guidance has been given in that space. But how does this impact, or how does this halo affect the way we should be thinking about this data? How does it play out in other industries? Are you seeing this beyond just healthcare and health data?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you have to look very far, hit Google and look at the most recent cases here in the US. Like it's starting to proliferate well beyond us. It happens across the globe. But here in the US, I mean, to be fair, we've been a little loosey-goosey. I mean, big data was the deal. We all were just like, let's bring everything in and then let's let the cards land where they may. And the reality is consumers are wising up and being like, wait a minute, you're making money off of my data. And I want to have a choice. Like I want to actively make that decision. And so we are starting to see it proliferate. You're seeing the FTC come to life around health data. And that we've historically called it adjacent health data. That's like the health data that you get on your Fitbit, your Apple Watch, certain apps. Specifically, there's a lot in the news recently about women's menstruation apps. And so all of those things are things that they're like, wait a minute, like you mean that data is not covered under HIPAA? I had no idea. And then you're starting to also see other industries join the bandwagon. I mean, financial services for its entire time has had a lot of structure and a lot of regulations applied. Those are being tightened down. Look at New York. They're doing a whole bunch in the US around what they expect and how they expect you to treat that data. But it doesn't stop there. I mean, back to the FTC, if you think about the FTC and the new direction regarding health information as a whole, that health information also covers like over-the-counter drugs. And with over-the-counter drugs, that means that potentially your local grocery store would be subject to this when they've never been subject to these requirements before, because they do sell ibuprofen, they sell Advil, they sell child's cough and cold. And so all of those things would now be considered a higher class of data that has additional requirements to it. So
businesses choosing between not selling those products just to remove the risk and the extra paperwork, or are they taking, okay, so we have to invest all this infrastructure for this extra regulation?
Yeah, I mean, I think not selling them is kind of the sledgehammer approach, and many of them are talking about, how do I do this? So how do I do this from my perspective is making a robust privacy framework. Understanding how do you want your privacy framework to look? So our privacy framework is, we look at what is our baseline regulation. We've identified what our baseline is. And then we do a comparative analysis every time there's a new regulation or a new jurisdiction that we're going into to evaluate what do we have to do to meet those requirements. And so the same is true here in the US. I get it, it's super complicated because now we have a whole host of state laws. There's no federal law. We have new laws in Canada that have additional protections and additional rights. So this is evolving and changing in Gen AI. It's changing in healthcare, financial services, public sector. So the list is lengthening. And I think any organization would be best served by creating a robust and flexible privacy framework, because trying to evaluate each of these regulations on its own merits in its own little vacuum is going to be hard to actually allow you to meet the requirements of the law.
Yeah. Now, I wasn't sure if I was going to ask this, but you opened up the door mentioning generative AI. So I'm going to get your perspective on this. Obviously, there's certain classifications of data because they provide signals about consumers that may or may not be used against them or against their best interests. With AI starting to really come on the scene and take signals from everywhere and be able to do extrapolations a million times better and faster than any human. Do you see that influencing the way we look at personal information, and especially sensitive personal information, because artificial intelligence can just get so much deeper in the assumptions and the modeling it can do with any bits of information about us?
Yeah, I mean, ethical frameworks around generative AI and responsible AI and generative AI usage is going to be important. Just because it can doesn't mean it should. And so we all need to take a step back and talk about what is our responsibility, and does it make sense? Because as Mike mentioned earlier, you know, if you take several of those bits of data and you bring it together, can that change how the data is seen? Which, yes, that's true. It can also change the classification of the data, which you need to understand if you're using it in a generative AI sense. That data that you thought was public can quickly go from public to restricted to confidential to sensitive in like a pretty quick order. And so I think there's a lot to be said about we need to be on the generative AI bandwagon, but we need to do it in a responsible manner and leveraging an ethical framework. And in fact, you mentioned the IAPP, and they have published an ethical framework of generative AI that I highly recommend people use as a resource to really help them understand where they're heading in that domain. Just sticking the data in and hoping for the best is probably not the direction you want to head.
Hope is not a strategy. I've heard that before.
Yeah.
All right. Well, as we look to wind down the episode today, Elizabeth, I'd love to get your kind of your projection hat on as we look into 2024, as the landscape continues to fragment and complexify. What do you see on the horizon? What should we be expecting heading into next year as it relates to data privacy and data protection in general? And do you see any major kind of signals or signposts out ahead of us?
Yeah, I mean, I have like my top 6 trends I'm tracking as we go into 24, and these are the ones I think are going to be the ones that we need to be aware of and have a plan for as we go into 24. And especially if you take a step back and think about how quickly the proliferation of privacy laws has occurred just in the last 5 years since GDPR. GDPR was a flag post, and now everyone's hopping on the bandwagon with their own flavor. Mm-hmm. And by 2024, which by the way is just a few days away, 75% of the global population will have their personal data covered under a relevant privacy regulation. So we quickly went from pretty low coverage to a pretty rapid growth to 75%.
Yeah.
So of those areas, my top of the list is responsible and ethical generative AI. I think that it's growing at a faster pace than we can keep up with and have an idea of how it should be used in an ethical manner, what data should be considered for use. Because not all data is likely something that you, I, or Mike would want to have included. I don't want my health data used in that manner. For example, the next one is data localization. I think, or another way of thinking about it is data sovereignty. I think it's a major topic in the digital economy. I think data sovereignty creates massive headwinds in a digital economy. And although I think it's a way people think it's going to control data, it doesn't actually entirely control the flow of data. And so I think the better conversation is, what are we afraid of, and let's solve for that. For the US market, there will continue to be a rapid expansion of privacy laws. And in general, I pretty much forecast that the consumers will continue to demand more control. They want more control. They want to have control over their own data. And so that will mean more privacy laws globally. Transparency. Transparency is a big topic. Transparency as a whole is going to be the currency of 2024 for trust. If you haven't had areas of transparency, you don't put it in your privacy notice, you don't say what you're doing with the data, you should expect that consumers are going to say, no thanks, I'm out, I can find this somewhere else. So transparent and easy to understand privacy notices are organizational privacy values will be important. Transparent tracking and transparent processing are all key features of 24. Federated IDs, which we talked about, which is, I think, a topic that's starting to bubble up now, but I think it'll play a bigger role in 24. And then my last one is the perennial cookieless future, which it just continues to hang on. I think we'll see something transition, but everyone should remember, get prepared, but it's talking about third-party cookies. It's not talking about all of your cookies. So.
Yeah, I love that point, and it's one I try to make every time when the subject comes up. So I appreciate you reiterating that. All right, Mike, you always keep me honest at the end of these sessions. Is there anything else we didn't cover today? Is there anything else you're hearing in industry news or related to data or privacy that we should make sure our audience hears about today?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll bring us home with the last few minutes. And actually, I like it because there's a few items that have come up recently that really hit are great examples of what Elizabeth just said. So Elizabeth, you mentioned transparency, well, and trustability, I would say. So here in the UK, our Information Commissioner's Office, that's our data protection authority for the United Kingdom, they just reiterated. Essentially, I'll just highlight the statement here. They just reiterated that reject all for a cookie banner on any CMP should be as easy to click as accept all. So, and if we look at the ICO's own consent management platform cookie banner, you can see here that accept all cookies and reject all cookies are they're side by side, they're equally prominent, they're the same color, they're the same font. I think that is, as evenly positioned as you could say, unless you could say that, the bottom left is more prominent than the right-hand side, and it's a dark pattern. But I think that, and so our ICO here has sent some of our biggest, most trafficked and most visited websites a reminder, and giving them 30 days to ensure their websites comply with the law. So that's one for any of our UK listeners to be aware of.
That's
just over
that's
2
just
weeks
within
ago.
that's just within the last couple of weeks, isn't it, Mike?
That statement, as you can see here, was the 21st of November. So exactly 2 weeks ago.
So if they've got 30 days to comply, there may be some people that are having a not so Merry Christmas.
Well, I mean, it's the 5th of December today, so they could be working solidly until just before Christmas, right, the 20th. And they could get that done, and then they can smile, give themselves a pat on the back, and head home.
Nice.
Another one, and again, a theme that Elizabeth hit on, is the continued proliferation of laws statewide in the United States. We've got, according to this, I believe, actually, Elizabeth, you're able to talk about this better than I, Utah Consumer Privacy Act. And apparently the next go live is, according to this article, December the 31st. Is that your understanding?
Yes. So the Utah Consumer Privacy Act that was enacted in the last legislative session, which was in January of 2023, will go into force on December 31st of this year. So happy New Year, everyone. Happy
New Year, all you people in the great state of Utah. And I've just been told that your national insect is the bee. Is that right, Cameron?
Our state insect? I know we're known as the beehive state, so that probably
beehive state. Far off. Right. Well, I actually just didn't take the opportunity to get some local honey the last time I was there. So I guess I'll have to next time I go. And then finally, as you say, just a reminder for everyone in 2024, some people think it's the apocalypse if you're a remarketing vendor. Some people think it's just something to be kept aware of. But Google will be starting to roll out their third-party deprecation to 1% of the Google Chrome install base starting in early 2024. So make sure, as Elizabeth says, you're aware, you know what third-party cookies support what functionalities on your websites, and ensure you're just hopefully actively, but at the very least, be able to react if anything strange happens on your website. And yeah, that's it, Cameron. That's all I've got for us today.
Thanks for the roundup, Mike. Appreciate that. Elizabeth, it's been such a delight having you on, chatting with you. I'm sure we'll have more discussions in the future. If people want to get a hold of you, reach out online, where can they find you in the online sphere?
Yeah, they can find me on LinkedIn, and it's Elizabeth A. Sexton.
Awesome. And then we know we're looking forward to seeing you and the whole Adobe crew in March at Adobe Summit in Las Vegas. Per our usual arrangement, ObservePoint loves sponsoring and supporting our partner Adobe there. So hope to see you and catch up sometime while we're down in Vegas. Also, we've got our Edge event later in the year in the about September timeframe. So keep that on your calendars, everyone. And hopefully we can have Elizabeth back for an encore performance. She joined us this year, and we'd love to have her insights then as well. Other than that, Mike, any final words from you?
Oh, you always put me on the spot, Cameron.
I do.
Final words. I would say, it's the last episode of DataChat Live before the festive period. So have a great festive period, whether it's whatever you celebrate. Wish you all a very merry end of 2023, and looking forward to an incredible data quality packed 2024.
Fantastic. Well, on that note, I am Cameron Cowan on behalf of Mike Fong and our guest Elizabeth Sexton. We'd like to thank you all for joining, and we'll see you next time in the new year. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you.